Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. People from all over the world of many different political affiliations and tech giants from many different companies, from Microsoft to Google to Apple to Amazon, don't agree on a lot of things, but many of them will agree on the importance of cybersecurity, and particularly cybersecurity education, in dealing with cybersecurity issues today and in preparing for cybersecurity for tomorrow. There are many courses at many universities that try to address some of these needs. One of the courses at North Carolina State University is an introductory graduate level course on cybersecurity called Software Security, which looks at the intersection of software engineering and security. This course goes over a variety of topics, starting from design principles to implementation, how to implement secure software, to how do we find vulnerabilities in software and how do we fix them, looking at access control and risk analysis, and many, many more topics. Prerequisite for the course is some basic software engineering knowledge, which we will get to later. The course was first offered in 2009, and over the years there have been a few different changes as new techniques from education and security are brought into play. It's been offered as a flip course. Currently, it uses the school's virtual computing lab as a tool for offering students resources. In spring of 2020, a big change was made when many of the assignments and some of the lectures were structured around something known as the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard. If you're unfamiliar with OWASP, it's the Open Web Application Security Project. It's a fairly well-known open source group. The standard, in its own words, provides a high-level set of requirements or tests that can be used by architects, developers, testers, security professionals, tool vendors, and consumers to define, build, test, and verify secure applications. These types of requirements are sometimes referred to as controls. There are a number of different standards of controls. These worked well for this particular course, partly because each requirement is verified in terms of, is phrased in terms of what needs to be verified. So example, verify that anti-automation controls are effective, verify that no more than 100 failed attempts per hour is possible. This is very similar to what students would have seen before in their software engineering courses. These requirements are organized into sections and subsections. This particular example fits into authentication verification requirements, and subsection general authenticator requirements, nothing in particular. All of this is in the unique identifier for the requirement. Requirements fit into 3 different levels. A requirement that fits into higher levels also fits into the lower levels. The base level are requirements that should be met by pretty much all systems. Level 2 are a little more complicated. These are for applications that are handling sensitive information and anyone else who can meet them. Level 3 are requirements that at a minimum, these should be met by critical systems. So something like many hospital systems or many systems in your car. A nice thing about these requirements is they also include a mapping to other standards, such as the Common Weakness Enumeration, which is a common categorization for vulnerability types. So if a system did not meet this requirement, it would probably have a vulnerability of type improper restriction of excessive authentication attempts CWE 307. There's also a mapping to NIST Special Publication 863 here, and several sections in there that one could go to for more information on how these sorts of requirements should be implemented. So that is our example, looking at how can we take these and use them in the course context. One of the big parts of the course is a project that lasts all semester and is broken into 4 parts. In this chart, we see the subcomponents of each project part. The black lettering indicates that the text for the component explicitly referenced ASVS. The lightest gray, the text of the assignment did not reference the ASVS and didn't really have much to do with it at all. The medium gray text indicates that this component may not have explicitly referenced ASVS, but students may have mentioned it in their responses because they had already used ASVS in other parts of the project and they've used it extensively in their class. Some ways that these assignments tied in with ASVS. Systematic penetration testing. Students wrote a set of test cases based on security information from ASVS. and information they had about the system under test. At the beginning, they didn't know a lot about security and only wrote 15 test cases. By project part 3, they knew a bit more and could actually write test cases for logging, which were also linked back to ASVS where reasonable. They also looked at the test coverage. How many security concepts did their test suite actually cover? After all, so far they've written 15 test cases and logging test cases, and so there were some gaps, and they wrote additional test cases to increase ASVS coverage. Similarly, with exploratory penetration testing, students didn't write test cases up front, but they had to prove that they had some sort of vulnerability and write a way to replicate that particular issue. So they again used test cases. Those test cases could then be mapped back to ASVS. For the other vulnerability detection techniques, static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, interactive application security testing, all of which involve testing tools, the students ran the tools, and through various ways, their output for true positives, they ultimately mapped back to ASVS. So in all of these different ways, ASVS was used as part of the assignments. There were a number of things we noticed that seemed to indicate that this was a very good thing to be using. The first one had to do with that exploratory testing activity I mentioned previously. We'd been planning to use the exploratory testing data elsewhere, but we weren't sure because we weren't sure how well students would perform. We were very surprised that students performed better with exploratory testing than with any other technique they'd tried. Because exploratory testing is so experienced and knowledge-based, this suggests that students actually learned something from their software security course by the time they got to this project part 4 assignment. There are many duplicates found by different students, but across the different students, over 175 unique vulnerabilities were found in the system under test from many different CWE types, and this was pretty exciting for us. Some other things that we noticed, so as we mentioned previously, these test cases map back to different other requirements or standards such as CWE and NIST standards. This enabled students to, if they didn't understand a particular concept, maybe they hadn't quite understand the way it was talked about in the course, or maybe they just wanted to know more. They could then go and look for more information. And so this standard probably helped motivate and enable some self-learning on students' part, which was really useful, especially in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Another area that this helped was when students may have done something that the teachers didn't expect, and when they were grading it and they couldn't figure out what is it that the students aren't understanding. As an example, there were 5 or 6 different test cases written on entropy. All of them were incorrect. But when we took a look back and we traced it back to the ASVS requirement, we could tell what it was the students weren't understanding. They were probably confusing password or security token bit length with entropy bits, which isn't something that's that important for an entry software security course. It's more of a cryptography component. It's not something we're as concerned about, whereas there might be other gaps we're more concerned about. Similarly, in tying in with these others, being aware of what security resources are out there, being aware of security standards is probably very, very good for our students, since many industry groups use compliance as much as they use actual security. And so being able to tie all these pieces together is very helpful for students in terms of what they would be doing in their jobs in the future. ASVS doesn't solve all problems. As we mentioned previously, it was a very high-level standard. As students often will, when students wrote test cases or when they wrote test cases to replicate their exploratory testing, they weren't always the most repeatable test cases. They often didn't have enough detail. This is something that, because ASVS is high level, it doesn't really address. And so there were other ways that faculty had to address the issue in discussions with students over and over again. These are just some of the things that we found helpful. If you have questions on what we did, how we used it, feel free to ask questions in the subsequent Q&A, or feel free to reach out to my advisor, Dr. Lori Williams, who's in charge of the course, or me, Sarah Elder. Thank you.
Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone. So this is a JC session, and you watch the video, and we have Lori and Sarah here to answer your questions. So please put your questions on the chat window. and they will be able to answer. Anybody?
23 people out there. Come
23
on.
people. Yes, yeah.
I think there are already some questions in chat.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I don't see any.
So, if it may be confusing them.
With those may be the
Yeah,
previous
the prior.
session. Yeah, the prior session.
Okay.
All right, so then shall I shoot one?
Sure.
Just get things going. So in the course you gave students a system to test, basically, right? So what kind of a system was that? Was that a real system, something with injected vulnerabilities, or something synthetic with also artificial vulnerabilities? What was the deal?
Sarah?
Sure. So it's a real system. It's OpenMRS. It's a medical record system. It is not licensed for use in the US normally. However, given that this was happening actually spring of last year, there was some talk about it being used in the US in extreme circumstances at that time. So it's very much a real system. We didn't inject any vulnerabilities. There are vulnerabilities in the system as we
Already.
yes, and
naturally.
Okay.
Yes. So the
Naturally
vulnerabilities
occurring vulnerabilities
that were in the system as is.
All right, that's good. And the conclusions that you have in the paper, they were all based on the exploratory testing results, or did you try to collect other information about the impressions of the students and whatnot? Are you planning to do that? If not?
Sarah, you're going to answer until you say you can't. So it's your paper.
Right, well, so
and there is a question in the chat too. You might go.
Oh yes, I just saw it. Yeah,
okay.
We'll get to that.
All right.
So the so in terms of the student performance, the results we saw in exploratory testing were the whole reason we wrote the paper, actually, because it was when we saw that we were shocked that they'd done that well. I've worked as a TA with the course before, Lori's taught it many times, and so that was the motivation for the course. We are, as a part of another study, doing some additional parsing to gain a better sense of how well of another part of the project, but I do not have results from that. So.
All right, and you attribute the change, the performance, increased performance in exploratory testing to what you have introduced new in this course. Basically, the what is it? OWASP standard.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I can elaborate on that since I'm the one who taught the course 11 times. And so the ASVS that OWASP publishes is very comprehensive. And so it was the first time, like a lot of times in the past, I could tell the students, write 5 black box test cases or something like that. But then they could write 5 cross-site scripting or 5 whatever. But they were continuously throughout the semester pushed to go into pick a different control. And so they were pushed into standards and controls that they had to teach themselves in some cases and just get experience with in other cases. So the structure of the ASVS, I believe, and that's why it's an experience report, not a research paper, really pushed them into learning a lot more about security, which is why when they had 3 hours each to go off and explore on their own, they were able to identify so many. That's my belief, is that's why they were able to identify so many unique vulnerabilities, where if I did just tell them, write 5 more, I don't think they would have gotten that knowledge.
All right. And let's take some questions from the chat window. So the first question is from Ashkan. Could you please elaborate on how you chose the system? Probably this means the system that you used for testing.
Yeah, and I'll answer that one because I mean that was the choice that was made. Sarah wasn't even a PhD student at that point, and so I chose the OpenMRS system as the subject for that course a number of years ago. The reason that I did is because it's a security class, and medical record systems, privacy and security of a prime importance. And so it was very motivating to be able to, be in a medical domain where the records were so personal. Also, there was a plethora of vulnerabilities to detect every year. So every year we had a new version because they would have a new version a year later, but we never had to work too very hard. We did static analysis and fuzzing or dynamic analysis. We did a bunch of different techniques and found vulnerabilities. So the choice of the project was based upon the choice for the course.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Florian, and then we can go back to Ashkan later, who has a follow-up question. So Florian is asking, first complimenting, great overview, really awesome. To what extent did you cover testing for compliance to ASVS?
I guess coverage to ASVS. So
I guess.
So that was why they got pushed. Now there's, Sarah, you would know, 136 controls. How many controls in ASVS? Something like
136. I had it written down.
Yeah, something like 136. So we did not have the students write 136 black box tests. So they had to. So as far as coverage, we kept pushing them to get more coverage. Every assignment they had to get more coverage, but we did not cause them to cover the whole thing. Sarah, for a different study, ended up filling in all the blanks that they didn't do. And is the material for the course available? And yes, is the URL in the paper, Sarah? If not, I can put it in the chat. We'll get to some other question. I'll put it in the chat. But everything for the course is online, and happy to share whatever anyone wants, slides, anything. I didn't teach it this year. One of my PhD students, Matt Morrison, taught it for me this year, but mainly he kept it the same. But I'm happy. Oops, Sarah put it in there. So everything's there. If you need the PowerPoint slides, let me know.
All right.
Okay.
Do you want to take also the next question? As a side benefit, did the students learn more about the verification standard than they did in previous times?
Yes. Yeah. So before, I guess ASVS may have existed the year before when I taught it, but I wasn't aware of it. And so they definitely learned much more about like working hard to comply with the standard than in previous times. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. Maybe we can then look at Ashkan's follow-up question. He was asking whether you took advantage of static checkers to guide them towards the part of the core, system that is more vulnerable. Did you use any like adjunct tools for that, or they had to just figure out how to detect those vulnerabilities?
Or you can start anyway.
Yeah, sorry, I grinned a bit at that because yes, they absolutely did use static checkers because I just set them up for them. If you've ever set them up, they're a bit of a pain. So yeah, there's a wide range of assignments. They didn't, so for example, like static checkers was one portion of one assignment, and then they had other assignments that used dynamic checkers. And the first assignment, they had to write the test cases themselves before they used the static checkers. And so it's not just static checkers pointing them towards vulnerabilities per se. It is using, say, the standard to look for vulnerabilities that might not be found by a static checker. But they did use them. They did most of the configuration themselves even, so they used them pretty extensively. We didn't just hand them the outputs.
Yeah, and the other thing that we did was, because those types of tools can have false positives, so they had to take a subset of the vulnerabilities found with the tools and write a black box test to resurface that same vulnerability. And that black box test that they found would then they would have to find the control in ASVS and map it to the ASVS.
I see. Well. But by the time they did exploratory testing, they have already kind of experimented with the code a lot, so they kind of instinctively knew what to do.
Yeah,